Now, several economists have argued that the private sector should lead growth while government focuses on repairing and rebuilding state institutions, many of whom were, of course, repurposed for state capture and are still suffering as a result of the hollowing out of these organizations. Well, joining me to look at the role of the private sector in reviving our economy is Duma Gqubule. He's an economist from the Center for Economic Development and Transformation. Duma, good morning. Alexander Forbes' chief economist, Isaiah Mhlanga, said that they expected a negative outlook from Moody's due to the weak economic fundamentals. But he says that the private sector can make an impact if it stands up and speak together. The private sector can criticize, but it can also pose solutions and take the lead. If the Investec economist Annabel Bishop also said that South Africa was more at risk from the global economy and its slowdown, especially since the country had eroded fiscal space during the past decade. Do you share their sentiment that the private sector needs to actually come to the growth party and come to the stimulus party in terms of the stagnant economy?
I agree 100% with that, but I think there's this cult that's taken hold in a policy echo chamber that is in the private sector and in society, is that what we're having now is that we're going to have the most important medium-term budget statement since 1994.
Absolutely.
It is critical. And the government, our economy is at a crossroads. We've had 5 years of declining GDP per capita, and the IMF has forecast another 6th year next year of declining GDP per capita. And since Cyril Ramaphosa became president, we've had 3 out of 6 quarters of declining GDP. And also, since he became president 2 years ago, we've had 5 out of 6 quarters of declining investment. Now, if you go to the economics textbooks and see what happens in that situation, so if you look at between 2015 and 2018, there's been a collapse of government investment. So general government has has reduced investments by about 10% in real terms, and at the same time, the state-owned enterprises have cut investment by 26%. So we are having a public sector investment strike, not a private sector investment strike. And if you look at the figures over the same period, private sector investment has actually increased by 4%. So I would argue that we really I know these institutions have been damaged, but I saw a paper recently by Mark Swilling and a colleague of his. He says we should create ring-fenced institutions that will take part in the stimulus. So we can bypass the government, but I believe that the private sector, there is no way out of this mess except to have a fiscal and a monetary stimulus. But what we're going to see on Wednesday is that the government will choose a path of further economic ruin. So basically what's going to happen, Karima, is that the first thing is the ESCOM paper. So the government is going to say nothing that we don't know already. The second thing is that the government is going to say that they're going to lift the ESCOM debt, hopefully, to the sovereign debt. And the third thing, we're going to see the new strategy paper from Tito Mboweni. Now,
the new strategy paper does talk about business. In fact, it talks about bringing in private equity partners to failing state-owned enterprises. Last week, I had Zwelinzima Vavi here, the General Secretary of SAFTU, and he recognized that both public and private sector haven't exactly been poster girls and boys for efficient management. You have a situation where Deloitte and Touche, for example, is accused of having benefited at ESCOM for work that they haven't done. We have a situation where Judge Kriegler just told us now that business hasn't really come to the party, A, in terms of owning up to its role in state capture, and 2, in terms of growing South Africa's economy. What exactly is Tito's plan to attract local and foreign investors to a government that seems to be out of its depth in terms of the way forward?
Yes, so if you read this first version of the strategy document, I'll call it a neoliberal wet dream. So basically, every possible impediment to government involvement they're saying we're going to get rid of, to private sector involvement, we're going to get rid of. But there's a catch here. So if you look at the plan, the two most important things perhaps was the wholesale privatization of Eskom. But if you listen to President Ramaphosa in the National Council of Provinces, he was adamant there will be no privatization.
And yet he said to the Economist that he's open to equity partnerships.
Yes.
So, is he speaking through both sides of his mouth?
I thought so. I spent yesterday looking at it in detail, and he's actually not speaking through both sides. So the president was actually quite clear. He says, we see no point in privatizing the new power stations. That's the one. So then he says, the old ones are going to close. But if you come to us and you say you want to extend the life of that power station and you're going to involve the communities and the workers, so yes, that we will listen and talk to you if you're an entrepreneur, and that's what we'll do. So I thought he was talking through both sides. So what he's saying is that we will have a transmission. This is important, Karima. We'll have a transmission company, the grid company, that is state-owned. Generation will be state-owned, and also distribution will be state-owned, national and municipalities. But he's saying that they will have partnerships with the private sector in rebuilding Eskom. That's a different take from wholesale privatization. And the second thing that's going to go out of the Tito plan is that they took out the ANC at the Lekgotla. They took out the whole issue of labour market reforms.
Yes.
They said those must be put in
abeyance.
No, in NEDBLAC.
Yeah. Now, this morning in the papers, the president of COSATU, Zingiswa Losi, says that they have no problem in being close to Cyril Ramaphosa because they believe they can prevent an austerity-driven economic path. If you look at how fractured unions are and how fractured business is, because it's not speaking with one voice, I want you to focus on the role of business. What is it that they can actually do, considering that government is as weak as it is? And where should the leadership come from? You have BUSA, you have the Black Business Council, you have all kinds of institutions, but they don't really come up with a coherent plan and say, as business, this is our understanding of how you grow the economy.
Okay, so I presented to the Banking Association just before NASREC, and I said, well, the figures have changed now. We've got 9 trillion rands of institutional funds in South Africa. We've got the highest ratio of institutional funds to the GDP of our country in the world. So I said we should, the ANC calls it prescribed assets, but I don't want to focus on names, but we should find a way of diverting some of that to productive investments. You can call it prescribed assets, you can call it a voluntary accord, but I think it's now time for business to come behind this project to make sure that more of our financial sector assets are not just chasing returns on the stock and the bond markets, they're investing in productive assets that will grow the economy. So in terms of the stimulus, I've said it should be about 500 billion, and I've said, just for argument's sake, let's say half of it comes from the government, from the private sector. That could be their contribution.
All right, Duma, we have to leave it there. And, of course, all eyes on Tito Mboweni on the 29th, when he will be announcing that medium-term budget policy statement. And it's going to be interesting to see exactly what the mix is going to be between private and government in terms of getting involved in the economy. Up next, we take a look at the stories making headlines in the weekend newspapers. Stay tuned.